Nearly every nation has some sort of defining moment, a point at which it starts to become itself and can be distinguished from its neighbours or overlords. For America, it's the Declaration of Independence. For France, it's the Treaty of Verdun in 843. For China, the unification under the Qin dynasty in 221 BC, and the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. Video on him to come shortly, by the way. But the nation-defining moment for England was 1066, when King Edward the Confessor died without naming an heir, leaving the country in a succession crisis. And as a result, 3 men from 3 different nations would throw everything they had on a dice roll to become the next ruler of England. This fateful event would change everything about what it means to be English, the English language, the culture, and the eventual relationship with Europe. It's so important that when I was a history teacher in the UK, we began every high schooler's first history lesson with this story. For that reason, I was quite reluctant to make this video because if you're English, you probably already know the basics. But once you peel back the layers, 1066 and the Battle of Hastings is so much more interesting than you think, and it's one of the most misunderstood, scandalous, exciting, and of course, consequential moments in British history. So, in this video, we're going to give the subject the depth it deserves and give you the full story of 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, starting with that key moment, the death of Edward the Confessor on the 5th of January, 1066, probably from a stroke. Edward, the then King of England, had died before producing or naming an heir to the throne, and this was very bad news, because uncertainty about who will be the next king almost always means one thing and one thing only: war. And this is why monarchies were such a popular form of government throughout history. Knowing that the king's first son will be the next king makes the transfer of power peaceful and predictable and bloodless. But Edward the Confessor had no son, which meant the transfer of power might not be any of those things. By failing to produce an heir, Edward had failed to be a good king. It's often said that Edward the Confessor, who was canonised as a saint 100 years after his death, was more interested in his faith than in being a good king, which is why he left such a mess after his death. Edward gained his religious reputation from his acts as king, commissioning the project of Westminster Abbey, giving more and more rights to the church, and perhaps most famously, remaining celibate, hence that lack of an heir. And although these things sound very pious, the reality, as ever, is more complicated and more interesting. Although Edward did build Westminster Abbey, probably the finest religious building in England at the time, the motivations weren't strictly faith-based, but instead political. Earlier in life, he'd sworn an oath to take a pilgrimage to Rome, which, later in life, he realised he wasn't going to get around to. Building a monument to Christ in his own backyard was a good way to curry favour in Rome without having to take on the enormous journey. Let us not forget that Rome, the home of the Pope, God's supposed vicar on earth, was the centre of all political power and legitimacy in Europe at the time, and falling foul of the Pope's graces would have consequences. Consequences which we shall see later. As always, the relationship between crown and church makes leaders do funny things. For more on that, you can check out my deep dive on kings and Christianity here. Next on our list of debunking Edward's piety though, let's take a look at that celibacy claim. See, while it's tempting to think that abstention from the pleasures of the flesh is a holy virtue, Edward's case raises some eyebrows. See, despite all this celibacy stuff, Edward still got married, and his wife gives us some clues about why he didn't like knocking boots. See, Edward married Edith of Wessex, who was the daughter of a man named Godwin, the Earl of Wessex. The marriage, like all royal marriages, was political, intended to cement a fraught relationship between Godwin and the king, who both relied on each other for power and safety, but were just strong enough to threaten and annoy one another. Although they could have been the best of friends, Godwin and Edward mainly fell out over a previous succession crisis. See, before Edward became king, there was Harthacnut, a Viking king, and then before him, a man named Canute, also a Viking. This is all important because at the time, England was mainly composed of Anglo-Saxons, a kind of Germanic people that had colonised England in the 5th century. But, due to a peace treaty between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings around 200 years before, there was a sizable Danish or Viking population and culture in England's northeast. Over the 2 centuries, there'd been some cultural assimilation, but they were still distinct ethnic groups with their own riffs on language and culture. Canute and Harthacnut were Viking, Edward the Confessor was Anglo-Saxon. When Canute the Viking king died, there was a bit of a scramble to see who would be next. Either another Viking, Harthacnut, the king's son, or an Anglo-Saxon contender, a young man called Alfred, who happened to be Edward the Confessor's older brother. Alfred decided to challenge Harthacnut for the crown, but was intercepted by Godwin of Wessex. This was a bit of a scandal because Godwin was a fellow Anglo-Saxon and should really have rallied to Alfred's cause, but instead he betrayed him in order to protect the new Viking king, Harthacnut. Godwin had put ethnic division aside and snuffed out a bloody rebellion before it could ever get started. It was the right move. Unfortunately, however, Godwin then took things a bit too far and had Alfred, who was only around 20 years old, blinded by poking red-hot irons into each of his eye sockets. The idea was that a blind man could never be king, and Harthacnut would never have to worry about a civil war from another claimant to the throne. The reality is that through either a botched procedure, infection, or shock, Alfred died of his injuries, and Godwin had royal blood on his hands. Harthacnut wasn't particularly impressed with Godwin's brutal violence, but the issue was smoothed over with a few bribes and apologies. However, the next king, Edward the Confessor, was never really able to forgive Godwin for killing his brother Alfred, and never able to trust a man who would betray an Anglo-Saxon in order to protect a Viking. The two just couldn't get on, but they needed each other. Godwin was too powerful to ignore, and too valuable to try and get rid of. And so Godwin of Wessex and King Edward were destined to enjoy a life of bickering and mutual suspicion. What does any of this, though, have to do with the king's celibacy? Well, again, Edith, who was the wife of Edward, was also the son of Godwin, and so was stuck in the middle of these constant spats, and probably didn't feel much in the mood for baby making. Perhaps the king didn't quite feel like jumping into bed with the enemy. Perhaps he didn't dare to, out of respect to his frenemy Godwin. Just like Westminster Abbey, the king's celibacy was out of political considerations and not religious ones. One way or the other, though, the price for peace with Godwin was giving up a happy sex life and the possibility of heirs. Remember that name Godwin, by the way, because it will come up again. But back to King Edward the Confessor's religious shortcomings. See, if you're still in doubt about his lack of Christianity, this is a man who in 1053, a decade after becoming king, ordered a Welsh prince to be assassinated over a petty border dispute. Not only did he treat the sanctity of marriage and building of churches as mere political tools, but was now openly ordering the murder of children over relatively minor disagreements. Not very Christian. The truth is, Edward the Confessor was all around disappointing. He wasn't good at being a Christian, and he wasn't good at being a king. He failed to properly balance power within the realm, meaning that he was both enemies with and totally dependent on the Godwin family for his power. This led to an unhappy marriage, no heirs, and no real friends to guarantee a line of succession. The only successful political relationship within England that Edward had been able to nurture during his reign was with a man named Tostig, a son of Godwin. But they fell out in 1065 after it came to light that Tostig had been abusing his subjects in the north of England. Edward attempted to strip him of his lands, but Tostig refused and so was exiled. Remember this man Tostig, he'll become important later in the story. But as for Edward, it was a disappointing reign that ended disappointingly. And by ended disappointingly, I mean ended in a way that guaranteed the deaths of tens of thousands. The fact that he's the only English king to be canonised as a saint is an absolute farce. Eddie had shat the bed, and in January of 1066, he died in it, leaving those left alive to pick up the pieces and try to form a new government with the least amount of bloodshed possible. As the medieval historian Stephen Baxter writes, Edward's handling of the succession issue was dangerously indecisive and contributed to one of the greatest catastrophes to which the English have ever succumbed. And catastrophe is no exaggeration. See, typically, a civil war, or a fight over who's next in line, takes place between two sides. The coming fight for who would be the next King of England would have four. There were four separate people who felt that they had a rightful claim to be king, and they were all willing to spill blood over it. So, now we've properly dealt with Edward the Regressor, let's take a look at these four contenders for the English crown. In no particular order, we have Edward the Atheling, Harold Godwinson, William of Normandy, and another Harold called Harold Hardrada. Edward the Atheling and Harold Godwinson were Anglo-Saxon. Harold Hardrada was a Viking. William was neither. He was French. It's worth spending a bit of time going into each of these figures because they really are what makes this story crackle, and there's so much more to them than just where they came from. So first up, let's take a look at Edgar. He's the only one of these four contenders that actually has a legitimate claim to the throne with royal blood in his veins, which means he's definitely not going to be the winner here. That would be far too easy. Although he was the great-nephew of Edward the Confessor, and quite literally the last remaining male member of the king's bloodline, he was also 14 years old. Whoever was given or took the crown after Edward was going to have to fight for it. And Edgar was just a boy, with no political connections, and not even a nod of approval from the dying, heirless Edward. Although a tragedy for the chances of peace in England, this probably worked out the best for young Edgar, who, through nothing but young age, was forced to sit out the struggle for the crown. Instead, Edgar would go on to live until at least 1120, after a fairly interesting life, flittering around Europe, doing a stint as a crusader, and eventually retiring in Scotland. None of the other three contenders would be alive by 1087. Edgar managed to squeeze his lifespan just over the turn of the century, and for this reason, we don't really need to mention him anymore. He didn't participate, and he didn't die over it. If you want to know who the winner of all this was, it was probably Edgar, simply by virtue of not playing. Next up, we have Harold Godwinson. Remember that guy Godwin of Wessex, the man who Edward had a love-hate relationship with and had to marry his daughter Edith in order to keep the peace with? Well, it turns out that this Godwin had a son. He called him Godwin's son. Full name, Harold Godwinson. Although King Edward didn't really get on with Harold's father, Godwin, he died in 1053, and the next Earl of Wessex, Godwin's son, Godwinson, took over, and a bromance was born. Orderic Vitalis, a chronicler at the time, describes Harold as a man of exceptional physical stature, refined manners, unwavering determination, and sharp wit. He made an excellent aide to the king, and the two relied on each other to make their position strong and secure. Towards Edward's later reign, he relied on Godwinson to run his kingdom and administrate the realm for him, including a good deal of pasting the Welsh, while his wife Edith, also a child of the elder Godwin, looked after his health and cared for him physically. Godwinson had no blood tie to Edward, and so no official claim to the throne. But he was the king's brother-in-law through his sister Edith, and he was the second most powerful man in England after the king himself. What's more, when Edward was dying, he fell into a coma, without naming that heir or successor. Luckily for England, however, Edward supposedly regained consciousness for just enough time to name Harold Godwinson as the next king before slipping back into his coma and dying. The problem was that no one was present for the king naming Godwinson as successor, except for Godwinson and his closest supporters. So there was nothing to prove. He didn't just make it up to steal some legitimacy. I personally think Edward probably did express some desire for Harold to be king. Not out of any special fondness for him, but out of the realisation that if he didn't name someone now, then a war for England was almost certain, and Godwinson was a great choice. He was experienced, both as a military leader and an administrator, and he was also an Anglo-Saxon, meaning he shared the language and culture of both the current king and the majority of the English people. He was the favourite of the Witan, which is like the Anglo-Saxon Council of Elders and Power Brokers. Godwinson was also the brother of Edith, the king's wife, and his immediate family were well connected and on good terms with the king, including our earlier mentioned shit-stirrer Tostig, who was Godwinson's brother. Godwinson was professional, experienced, wealthy, powerful and popular. Naming him as the successor was the right move. The problem was, like at every other stage in his reign, Edward didn't think it through and failed to leave any evidence or gather an audience to recognise his final wishes. Through poor kingship, he had unwittingly stiffed Godwinson and given the other contenders an in to push their claims. Speaking of our other contenders, let's have a look at candidate number 3, William of Normandy. Much like Harold Godwinson, William of Normandy had no blood claim to the throne of England. He was also French. At least, those are the two half-truths you often hear about him. Technically speaking, William did have the weakest possible blood claim to the throne. William was the grandson of Richard II of Normandy, who happened to be Edward the Confessor's maternal uncle. That technically made William and Edward cousins, although William was actually a bastard, so none of those claims are particularly binding. But it was something, and a lot more than Godwinson had. William wasn't exactly French either. His ancestors were Viking, who'd been given French land in Normandy around 200 years ago. Northmen, which had become locally shortened to Norman, hence Normandy, weren't French in origin, but Scandinavian. However, like in England, there had been some assimilation, and so William, despite being at least a little culturally Viking, spoke French and was very, very Christian. Despite being from a different country and with a pretty measly blood claim, William had his reasons to feel like the crown was his. Firstly, he didn't recognise Edward the Confessor's wish that Harold Godwinson be the next king, because in 1051, some 15 years before all this went down, Edward had apparently promised the crown to William. William argued that in exchange for providing assistance and refuge to the king during his spat with the Danes and his time hanging around in Normandy, Edward the Confessor, as a reward, had told William he could be the next king. Whether or not this is true is open to debate, but most historians think it's made up. What's not made up, however, is that in 1064, just 2 years before Edward's death, Harold Godwinson had actually sworn an oath of allegiance to help William become the next King of England. And not only that, but he made this oath over some sacred relics, which was the pinkiest of all pinky promises, and a promise that Godwinson had now broken by throwing his hat in the ring. William's claim fell airtight. He had Godwinson's promise of help in 1064, the supposed approval of the king in 1051, and a tenuous blood tie, even if it was very loose. This was enough for the Pope, Alexander II, who decided to back William and bless him and send him a papal banner to aid him in his quest, mainly because Harold Godwinson had decided to backtrack on his promise to support William. God was now on William's side, and all because Godwinson was a supposed oath breaker. But the reality is that Godwinson had actually sworn this oath under duress and not out of any admiration or confidence in William. We're not sure exactly what happened because the sources clash. Some say that William had custody of some members of Godwinson's family and that he would have to swear an oath to William in exchange for their safe return. Essentially, they were hostages. Another story claims that Godwinson was shipwrecked in Normandy and picked up by William, who would only release him on the condition that he swore this oath. Either way, it wasn't exactly voluntary, and in any modern court of law would be thrown out as non-binding. But it was good enough for William, and it was good enough for the Pope. And so, despite the shaky bloodline, unreliable claim that he was promised the throne, and illegitimate oath from Godwinson, William felt that he had the right to pursue his claim. And this was bad news for the other contenders. William was militarily experienced and extremely politically astute. When William was around 8, his father, Robert I of Normandy, died, and from that point onwards, William had a target on his back. He was immediately thrown into the fray and exposed to all manner of violence, plotting, and danger. And then, against all odds and 13 years of struggle, came out the other side as the undisputed Duke of Normandy. William was a man who understood both power and warfare. By 1066, he'd been Duke for over 30 years, had his first battle before ever reaching puberty, and had been in a state of continuous and successful war for nearly a decade straight between 1047 and 1054. Whatever the case, William was going to be a force to reckon with, but he wasn't quite as scary, at least on paper, as our last contender, Harold Hardrada. Harold Hardrada wasn't quite like the other boys. See, all the other claimants were basing their right to the throne on their relationship with Edward. Edgar was a blood relative and descendant. Godwinson was Anglo-Saxon and he was family, although not by blood, but nonetheless had a good working relationship with both the king and the kingdom. And finally, William, despite being French, was both a distant relative and had some political ties to both the king and his earls. Hardrada had none of this, was a Viking, and was already King of Norway. His excuse for throwing the hat in the ring, and it was an excuse, was that the previous Viking King of England, Harthacnut, had made a promise to the previous King of Norway, Magnus I, that if either should die, then their lands would be inherited by the other. Technically, this meant that when Harthacnut died, it should have been Magnus I, not Edward the Confessor, who inherited the throne. Nonetheless, Harthacnut must have changed his mind, and in the end he personally backed his half-brother Edward to be the next king. Magnus was unable to do much about this because he was very busy dealing with a revolt in Denmark, and so everything was more or less forgotten, and that was until Magnus died in 1047, and Hardrada inherited the throne of Norway, and as far as he was concerned, that gave him the right to be the King of England too. And let me just spell this claim out for you because it's as ridiculous as it sounds. Basically, the promise Harthacnut made to Magnus in 1038 was transferred to Hardrada when he died in 1047, which meant that Edward the Confessor, who was crowned in 1042, had never been the legitimate king of England. Magnus would have been. And so now, nearly 30 years later in 1066, Hardrada was within his rights to take back the crown. Obviously, none of this makes much sense, and most of the other players agreed. Of all the claimants to the throne, Harold Hardrada's was the weakest by far. But that didn't change anything for Hardrada. He was determined to pursue his rights, even if that meant settling things by force. It's worth going into Hardrada's past and his relationship with violence because by 1066, he'd lived an incredible life. I'll do my best to keep it brief, but basically, as a teenager, he was exiled from Scandinavia after ending up on the wrong side of some civil wars which he physically participated in, by the way, and so then afterwards, he worked as a mercenary in Eastern Europe for a bit, eventually becoming captain of the forces of Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev. After his stint there, he headed down the Mediterranean, where he became part of the elite Varangian Guard for the Byzantine Emperor Marcus IV. There, he earned the nickname Thunderbolt of the North, and eventually rose to become leader of that Varangian Guard, making him one of the highest ranking soldiers in the entire Byzantine Empire. But after a decade of service, in 1041, a new emperor, Marcus V, took control, and Marcus didn't like Hardrada, so he betrayed him and locked him up in prison. Hardrada responded by breaking out of prison and leading the Varangians in a revolt against the new emperor. The revolt was successful and concluded with Hardrada personally dragging the emperor out of his palace and blinding him. Then, after over a decade of service in Constantinople, Hardrada was done. And so he headed back to Norway in 1045, where he basically just threatened the existing king, Magnus I, to give Hardrada the crown or be put to the sword. Magnus complied, although technically they shared the throne as co-monarchs, but Magnus died a year later in 1047, and so by the time 1066 rolled around, Hardrada was the sole ruler of Norway, one of the most accomplished military leaders in Europe, and probably around 60 years of age, which makes him the oldest contender in the game. Even his name, by the way, is a product of his reputation. His real name is Harold Sigurdsson, but the nickname Hardrada, or Hard Ruler, stuck. So, those are our 4 players, but as we mentioned earlier, Edgar didn't really participate, so in reality, those are our 3 players. The Anglo-Saxon Earl and friend of the King, Harold Godwinson, the French Duke and staunchly Christian William of Normandy, and the Viking King and all-around hard man, Harold Hardrada. So, what happened next? So far, I've made it sound like all of these characters had suddenly become interested in the English crown at the exact moment that Edward died without naming an heir. The reality is that all of them, for quite a while, had been waiting with bated breath for Edward to pass away, hoping that the final nod would go to them. Edward knew that both William and Hardrada had designs on the crown, and throughout his career, he would gently hint to both of them that they could be the next king, just so that he could avoid any potential conflict. In reality, he was just kicking the problem down to the next generation, but fans will call him the Great Peacekeeper. Nonetheless, when the dying Edward told Godwinson he should be king next, it must have been an unbelievable shock to William and Hardrada. To Godwinson, the man who spent 10 years ruling a kingdom for a king with no heir, this nod of approval must have been an eye-rollingly obvious moment and something that was, frankly, overdue. But even though Godwin finally had the late king's approval just before he died on January the 6th, he knew that wasn't going to be enough, and that the other 2 claimants would be gunning for him if they felt they had a chance to snatch that crown. Speed was now everything. And so, the very next day, on January 6th, the Witan, the Anglo-Saxon Council of Elders, convened to discuss who should be the next king. Godwinson had unanimous support. And so, they'd bury the dead king in the morning and crown the new king that same afternoon. This, by the standards of the time, was an outrageously shocking development. You see, typically, there would be an interval, sometimes months, between a late king's funeral and a new king's coronation. This was partly out of respect for the previous monarch, and partly to give the Witan time to convene and make sure that whoever was going to be next was suitable and capable to be king. This was important because crowning an unsuitable heir was an irreversible act. The belief at this stage in history was that from the moment you crowned a king, he became the legitimate and legal ruler for life. They believed that something occurred during the ceremony and coronation which fundamentally altered the person being crowned, and at that moment imbued him with God's favour and the right to rule. In theory, this meant that anybody on earth could be crowned as king, and once they were chosen by God, and there was nothing you could legally or morally do about it. This, for anyone who's interested, stands in contrast to later thinking, where the common belief was that the king was preordained by God and born with the divine right to eventually rule, and that the coronation was essentially just symbolic and did not bestow any transformative powers on the new king. And so, an illegitimate king wouldn't suddenly become legitimate and God-chosen simply because they'd become crowned. It's similar to the Catholic and Protestant arguments around transubstantiation at the Eucharist. Catholics believe that the bread and wine literally become Christ's body and blood, even if they still appear to be bread and wine, whereas Protestants see the bread and wine as symbols of Christ that are important to faith, but not to be taken as literal transformations that happen upon consuming the offering. I'm talking about all this because, as I said, it was typical to wait weeks or months to coronate the new king, but Harold Godwinson had got ahead and got himself crowned while Edward's body was still warm. Godwinson and his Witan had gambled that their best chance for peace was to get the new king crowned before anyone else could get the chance to come to England and pursue their claim. Because once Godwinson had the crown, he was the legitimate king, full stop. It wasn't the done thing, but this seemed the best way to avoid any possible war over succession. And it's not like Godwinson needed a probation period anyway, since he'd been essentially running the kingdom for Edward for over a decade. Despite seeming remarkably practical and nicely meritocratic to us, it's hard to explain just how shockingly outrageous this would have been to the people of the time. Convention had been broken, and feathers were severely rustled. William of Normandy was so furious at the news that he immediately started digging around to try and find a way to undo Godwinson's coronation. The way he did this was by questioning who actually crowned Godwinson as king. The Anglo-Saxon sources say it was Eldred, the Archbishop of York, who crowned Godwinson, but William argued that it was a man named Stigand, who was not recognised by the church as an archbishop, and so wasn't technically able to crown a new king. Despite all this back and forth though, this argument wasn't really enough to change things. If William wanted to properly challenge Godwinson's legitimacy, he'd need to appeal to a higher authority. So, he went running to Pope Alexander II, who was sort of like the hall monitor of early medieval Europe, and complained to him that not only had Harold Godwinson lied about his oath to support him becoming the next king, but had now had himself crowned by a bogus priest within hours of Edward's funeral. The Pope was just as horrified as William, and decided to throw him his personal support and backing, full approval to invade England, and that aforementioned papal banner that William could fly above his army as they went to crush Godwinson in the Pope's name. Harold Godwinson's haste to secure the crown had apparently cost him his relationship with God. It seems ironic to me that Edward the Confessor had been able to garner a reputation as a good Christian by building some churches and abbeys instead of running his country properly, which, as we're about to see, will lead to the deaths of tens of thousands of Europeans. But Godwinson, who acts professionally, decisively, and in the interest of peace, albeit with the perk of a crown, was demonised by the Pope as an immoral oath-breaker. And then that same Pope, who was apparently the arbiter of right and wrong, gave William the blessing to go from the shores of France into England and do a lot of killing in order to try and steal a crown that was never really his, in the name of a God that was supposed to love peace and mercy. Nonetheless, there we are. Even though Godwinson had his crown, William and the Pope didn't buy it. And within a couple of days of getting the news, William of Normandy gathered his nobles for a meeting to discuss how they were going to invade England and kill Harold Godwinson. Meanwhile, the other Harold, the Viking king, Harold Hardrada, king of Norway, would have probably received the news that both King Edward had died and that Godwinson was the new king, all in the same day. Hardrada was disappointed, but not really in a position to do anything. As we mentioned, after he'd been crowned, Godwinson was the legitimate king now. And anyway, Hardrada's coffers were empty after a costly war in Denmark. It must have been quite disappointing for Hardrada. He finally got his moment, but because the timing was wrong, he was left unable to act. It looked like the struggle for the crown was going to be a showdown between William and this new king. Godwinson knew that William would have to invade by crossing the English Channel with his army. It was quite hard for William to hide this when he was building 700 warships from scratch, specifically for the job. So, Godwinson raised his army, which would have consisted mostly of fjord, peasant men, farmers basically, who were called up to fight whenever the king needed extra muscle. They weren't particularly well trained, and their equipment was poor, often using farming tools as weapons, but they would have been strong men, and since they were defending their homeland, would have been motivated to put up a good fight. At the centre of Godwinson's army, however, were his elite soldiers, the Huscarls, who were full-time, professional, well-equipped, well-armoured soldiers who fought in the Viking style, on foot in a shield wall with great axes and broadswords. With his fjord and his elite Huscarls, Godwinson made his way to the Isle of Wight, where he would wait to intercept William's invasion. It was a smart plan. If William was going to make the crossing to England, he would have to navigate the straits around the Isle of Wight, which would give Godwinson the chance to strike at the invading Normans while they came ashore, disorganised and vulnerable. The battle lines had been drawn, and the showdown of the century was about to commence, but then nothing. Neither man moved. Godwinson waited anxiously for invaders that didn't seem to want to come for 7 months. William stayed put. He had been kept from making the crossing by one thing and one thing only. The wind was blowing the wrong way. This was, as you can imagine, fantastic news for Godwinson, who was able to altogether avoid a fight simply because of poor weather. Eventually, by September of 1066, Godwinson decided to march back to London. It didn't make sense to keep his fjord out in the fields any longer because William had missed his window to attack England, at least for that year anyway. See, in the winter, the English Channel becomes much more dangerous. This is the same section of water which nearly 900 years later would force the Allies to push back D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, because of bad weather. And then 2,000 years before all that, the Channel almost killed Julius Caesar as he returned from Britain. Over the last 2,000-ish years of British history, the English Channel always gets the last say, and 1066 was no different. But even if we ignore the Channel crossing issue, William had just spent 7 months on the French coast with his entire army just waiting for the weather to change. They'd be low on supplies, and William was probably running out of cash to pay his men. To Godwinson's relief, 1066 would not be the year that England saw a foreign invasion. Perhaps by next spring, William may have lost the steam to launch any kind of attack. It was the morning of September 8th when Godwinson breathed his sigh of relief and decided to pack up and march back to London. But by that afternoon, he received a message which would have shattered his hopes for peace in England. A Viking army had appeared in the north. They were some 15,000 strong, twice the size of Godwinson's army, and being led by that thunderbolt of the north, Harold Hardrada. But hang on, when we last left Hardrada, he didn't want to make a move on the crown. So, what changed? Well, Godwinson had been betrayed. Remember Tostig, the guy I said would come up again? The guy who was really close with Edward the Confessor before being exiled for mistreating his subjects in 1065? Well, we need to talk about him for a second. Tostig was the brother of Harold Godwinson, and as a result enjoyed a relative level of power and status. In 1055, he was made Earl of Northumbria by Edward, who he was on quite intimate terms with. Tostig may have made for a good companion for courtly dinners, but he did not make a good earl. He spent too much money, was insensitive to the local customs and culture of northern England, and spent too much time in the south to be able to effectively govern and protect Northumbria. 10 years into his reign, the local thanes and peasantry staged a revolt, occupied the city of York, and declared Tostig to be unlawful. They petitioned King Edward to replace Tostig with another earl, but in classic Edward the Confessor fashion, he refused to make time in his calendar to prevent the uprising, and instead sent his right-hand man and brother of Tostig, Harold Godwinson, to negotiate with the rebels. When Godwinson heard their list of grievances, he knew that if there was going to be peace in Northumbria, his brother was going to have to go. And so Godwinson returned to the king to relay the rebels' demands that Tostig be removed as earl, and recommended that the king listen. Edward took Godwinson's advice, but when he attempted to strip Tostig of his title of earl in 1065, Tostig flat out refused to accept the king's judgment. And so, as punishment for open disobedience, he was forced into exile. Godwinson had put the demands of the country over loyalty to an incompetent and cruel brother, but Tostig walked away, plotting vengeance. Luckily for him, just 3 months after all this, Edward the Confessor died in January of 1066, and he would have his chance to get revenge on his brother as the contenders scrambled to reach for the crown. Tostig went to try and make an alliance with William, promising to help his invasion if, in exchange, he could be restored to his position as Earl of Northumbria. In the end, though, this didn't work out. While William was amassing his army and fleet in Normandy, Tostig and his men participated in smaller-scale raids across the northeastern coast. They were an abject failure, and in the spring of 1066, he and his men were decisively crushed. What surviving men he had left abandoned him, and Tostig was no longer of any use to William. It must have added insult to injury that the man who delivered him this crushing defeat was the new Earl of Northumbria, his replacement, a man named Morcar. All of this defeat and humiliation would only push Tostig to further and further extremes, however. Left without soldiers, or much money, he figured his best bet would be to go north and see if the Viking king, Hardrada, was interested in helping him exact revenge on his brother. And so, while Godwinson was down in the Isle of Wight waiting for a French invasion that never came, his brother Tostig was up in Norway, getting into bed with Hardrada. The sources tell us that when Tostig found the Norwegian king, he was decidedly unenthusiastic about pursuing another costly war after he'd thrown so many resources into Denmark to achieve basically nothing. But Tostig's anger and determination impressed Hardrada, and he came bearing knowledge that Godwinson was vulnerable. He told Hardrada that his brother was currently in the Isle of Wight and had been there for several months, expecting an invasion from the south. If Hardrada could attack from the north, he'd catch Godwinson completely by surprise, and the road to London would be open. Not only that, but those same winds, which were keeping William in port, were blowing the perfect direction for Hardrada's warships to swoop down. Crowns are not usually this easy and this ripe for the plucking. The Viking king was sold. He would sail south. Harold Godwinson wouldn't find out until he was marching back from his 7-month-long wait in the south. It looked like Tostig was about to get his revenge. Godwinson, of course, had no idea that he'd been betrayed by his own brother. All he knew is that Hardrada and his Viking army had appeared out of nowhere and were quickly consolidating their positions around Northumbria, where the ethnically Viking population would have likely welcomed these Norwegian soldiers. This put Godwinson in an impossible position. The longer he left Hardrada in the north, the stronger he would get. But if he left London now, there was always that razor-slim chance that William could reappear and march right onto England without so much as a shot fired. We don't know exactly what happened next, but what we do know is that Godwinson got the news that the Vikings were invading on the 8th of September, but he wouldn't march north until a full 12 days later on the 20th. There are two possible reasons for this. Reason one is that Godwinson had a smaller army, led by the Earl of Northumbria, Morcar, that was currently stationed in the south. He may have expected Morcar to deal with the Vikings himself, but Morcar, with around 4,000 men, was outnumbered 3-1 by the Vikings, and Godwinson was well aware of this. The second reason, which I'm more inclined to believe, is that Godwinson needed time to reorganize and resupply his army. He'd probably exhausted his entire supply of food while waiting around on the Isle of Wight for 7 months, and when he decided to head home, he had started to disband his fjord to return to their farms. They would now all need to be collected and organised back into a fighting army for a second time. All of this, in a world without instant messaging or automobiles, took time. Godwinson would have to spend a fortnight biting his fingernails and waiting until his army was ready to bolt north. Godwinson's man in the north, Earl Morcar, would have to buy him some time and pin Hardrada down until the main English army arrived to finish the job. Morcar chose to meet the Viking army at Fulford on the 20th of September. He set up his forces right next to the River Ouse, where he could wait for Hardrada to approach. It was a move with considerable testicular heft. On their right was the river, on the left was the marshlands, and behind them was yet another marsh. This meant that the only way for the Vikings to get past the Saxon army was to go through them. But it also meant that if things turned sour for Morcar, his men would have no means of retreat, since every other direction was impassable. The message was clear, and since Hardrada had the high ground, he could see it clearly. The English army were going to hold this cul-de-sac for as long as it took, until reinforcements from Godwinson could arrive. Luckily for Hardrada, however, this also gave him some much-needed time. It had been his advance guard that had spotted Morcar at Fulford, and Hardrada still needed to wait for the other half, some 6,000 men of his army, to turn up and deploy on the battlefield. Since the Saxons were happy to wait, Hardrada could also wait and get stronger with each passing hour. This, however, is exactly what Morcar had wanted, and while Hardrada's army were disorganised and assembling their battle lines with only half their men available, Morcar and his Saxon army sprinted uphill towards the Vikings and smashed into their ragtag lines. It was so effective that Morcar's left section was able to shove the Vikings directly into the marshland, where the slippery footing made effective resistance impossible. It was a strong start, but not strong enough. Although Hardrada had lost around 1,000 men in the opening melee, these were quickly replaced by the reinforcements being sent into the fight, and eventually, by sheer numbers, they were able to punch a hole through the Saxon line, splitting their army in two, which then made them even more vulnerable against Hardrada's overwhelming numbers. Since the Saxons had given themselves no avenue for retreat, and were also tired from their shock attack on the Viking lines, their losses were extremely heavy, although Morcar was able to personally escape the fray and retreat to the city of York. The Vikings followed him there, and a surrender was negotiated. Tostig, who used to enjoy Morcar's job as Earl, and had previously endured a humiliating surrender under him, would lead these negotiations with a painfully smug attitude. In the end, though, the surrender was near complete, with the only condition being that the Vikings would not force entry into the city of York. Tostig, ever motivated by personal greed and ambition, agreed to this request, but only because he expected to be the next Earl of Northumbria and didn't want the prior city of York looted by Hardrada's thugs. The defeat of Morcar at Fulford reached Godwinson just as his army had finished their preparations, and he immediately marched north to deal with the threat himself. He did this at breakneck speed, marching both throughout the day and the night, doing 190 miles, or 310 kilometres, in just 4 days. When he arrived in York on the 24th of September, Godwinson found no advanced guard or defence of any kind. It was almost as if the Vikings weren't actually in England. This was because Hardrada and Tostig had assumed that Morcar was the only army they would face that winter. Godwinson was supposed to be stationed in the Isle of Wight, dealing with a threat from William, so after the Battle of Fulford, Hardrada had more or less let his guard down. Godwinson stopped to speak to the people of York, where they told him that they'd been ordered by the Vikings to deliver more hostages and supplies to their camp by Stamford Bridge on the next day. Godwinson realised he could make a beeline directly to Hardrada's camp while they were sitting there and waiting for their hostages and food to arrive. And so, on the 25th of September, while the Vikings were awaiting their cargo at Stamford Bridge, the entire English army, some 11,000 men, roughly the same number as Hardrada's, suddenly appeared over the hill. They had no idea there was an English army in the vicinity until they all came into view at once, and were within almost immediate striking distance. Hardrada and Tostig were left scratching their heads and wondering what to do. They hadn't been expecting a battle, and worst of all, most of their troops weren't equipped for a fight, and their heavy armour had been left behind on their ships some 25 kilometres away. It put the Vikings at an unbelievable disadvantage, since they were now vulnerable to even the most rudimentary farming tools which could cut or stab through cloves much, much easier than through heavy chainmail. However, a messenger from the Saxon army approached Hardrada and Tostig. He refused to give his name, but demanded to speak before the battle. During the conversation, it became clear that Hardrada had no intention of leaving England, and so the messenger switched tacks and offered Tostig a deal. If he would come and join Godwinson's army and help to drive Hardrada back into the sea, then he would be given back his prized position as Earl of Northumbria. After a pause, Tostig said he would accept the earldom, but wouldn't turn on Hardrada. Perhaps they could make a deal. He asked the messenger, "What lands would you be prepared to give King Hardrada, who has gone through so much trouble and fought a battle over this whole affair?" The messenger spat back, 7 feet of English land. He was offering Hardrada just enough property for a grave. This ended negotiations, and the messenger left. To some, a messenger threatening a king with death would have been either incredibly impudent or highly intimidating. Hardrada didn't think it was either. He thought it was badass, and he was so impressed that as soon as the messenger was out of earshot, he asked Tostig if he knew the man's name. Tostig told him. That was Harold Godwinson himself. Upon returning to his army, Godwinson gave the order for his troops to go on the attack, and they descended onto the Vikings immediately. Outnumbered and without their fighting gear, it should have been a slaughter. But luckily for them, the English army was delayed by a river which separates the two sides, and only one small bridge by which to cross the water. Hardrada sent a single Viking warrior, whose name is lost to history, with the job of holding the English back for as long as possible, and buy enough time for his reinforcements and equipment to be brought from their ships on the coast. It must be said that this lone warrior did an outstanding job. Due to how thin the bridge was, soldiers were only able to come at him 1 or 2 at a time, and each time they came, he held his ground. He was able to single-handedly cut down 40 men before the English were finally able to kill him by climbing under the bridge and thrusting spears upwards through the wooden slats. This wound, probably to the legs or groin, was enough to fell him, and he was promptly slain by the soldiers on the bridge, at which point the English army were able to pour over the river and form a line opposite the Viking army, which was scrambling to organise itself. Although the lone warrior had brought some time, it wasn't enough, and Godwinson's army was soon upon the undermanned, under-armoured Viking forces. But Hardrada's reputation for military prowess wasn't for nothing. Despite the disadvantage, his army was able to stand their ground for hours and put up ferocious resistance as they held on for reinforcements and gear. This eventually came in the form of a man named Eystein Orr, who had been guarding the Viking fleet at Rickle, again 25 kilometres from the battle. He headed to Stamford Bridge with all due haste, and when he arrived with his fully armoured troops, he immediately threw himself onto the front lines, in a charge that would go down in the Norwegian chronicles as Orr's Storm. It was able to briefly slow the English advance, but ultimately he was overwhelmed along with the rest of Hardrada's army. By the end of the day, the victor was clear. Godwinson and the majority of his men were standing. The same could not be said of the Vikings. Their king, Harald Hardrada, had been slain during the fight, and just as Godwinson had offered, he received his grave in the English soil. So also did Tostig, who didn't survive the battle. It wasn't just the leaders who died either. The slaughter of their army was so extreme that of the 300 Norwegian boats that had been packed with soldiers for the invasion, there was only enough survivors to fill 24 for the return trip, less than 10%. According to Orderic Vitalis, who visited the site of the battle some 50 years later, he described it as easily recognisable by the piles of bones that still bear witness to the heavy losses. It was a complete and utter victory for Godwinson, who leveraged this triumph to force Hardrada's son, Olaf, into pledging a non-aggression treaty with England. And from that day onwards, the Vikings would never again invade England in the entirety of British history, making the Battle of Fulford the last ever Scandinavian victory over an English force. Godwinson had speed marched from the Isle of Wight all the way to York in order to deal with a surprise invasion from a better equipped, better experienced, larger Viking army led by one of the most experienced and fearsome military leaders in Northern Europe, and he'd won. The invader had been vanquished, and it was late September now, which meant winter was getting ever closer. Godwinson had earned himself a well-deserved breath of relief and a chance for he and his men to reorganise, lick their wounds, and get ready for William, who was probably going to attack in the spring of 1067. But for the second time that month, Godwinson was about to get slapped in the face with another piece of chilling news. On September the 28th, just 3 days after his victory at Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy and his army had landed in Pevensey on the south coast of England. The victorious Harold probably received the news within a day or two of this fact while he was making his gentle march down towards London. The timing could not have possibly been worse for Godwinson. He had just quick-marched his army 190 miles north and forced them to fight a monumental battle. Now, he was having to grapple with the reality of marching over 200 miles back down south, where he would have to throw his exhausted troops at an invading army for a second time, and an invading army which was fresh and not yet fatigued by weeks of marching and fighting. As more reports flooded in, the severity of the situation became more and more clear. William's army was at least 10,000 strong, and unlike Godwinson's, was composed completely of professional soldiers, unlike the English, who were mainly made of the peasant fjord. He had also brought with him cavalry, at least 1,000 strong, in contrast to Godwinson, who had none. The invaders were also erecting fortresses in and around Pevensey, meaning that they could put up stubborn resistance, possibly for months if they had the supplies. It's worth remembering that by the standards of the time, this was an incredible accomplishment by William. This was a time when campaigns would often only last a season and were restricted to the summer months. He, on the other hand, had been able to feed and sustain an army for nearly a year and crossed the English Channel during autumn and was now operating an army 10,000 strong in hostile territory with the sea between himself and any potential resupply. It's easy to understand why this news came as almost unbelievable to Godwinson, who was by now racing south once again to secure the city of London before William advanced. Godwinson's plan was to get to London, where he could allow his men to rest and resupply, and essentially wait for the Norman invaders to come to him. He arrived in London sometime around the 5th of October, when he planned to wait. Unfortunately, however, William had no intentions of trying to attack Godwinson in London, where the defences would put him at considerable disadvantage. And so, William began raiding the surrounding areas and building more fortifications, essentially turning the south of England into a heavily defended outpost. This forced Godwinson to act. The longer he waited, the stronger William's position became. And, as king, Godwinson had a responsibility to protect the farms and villages of England, which were now being raided by foreign invaders. To do nothing would send a message that perhaps William was the better man to be wearing the crown after all. And so, after around a week of rest and preparation in London, he ordered his exhausted army to their feet for one last push south and one last army to vanquish. He knew from his reports that William was set up in Hastings, and so he planned to execute another lightning march and catch his enemies off guard like he had at Stamford Bridge. This, however, was unsuccessful, as William's scouts spotted him coming the day before on the 13th of October 1066. Once William was alerted of Godwinson's position, he began planning for the fight. The next day, on the 14th of October, the two armies faced off near Hastings. Godwinson and his army set up a defensive position on top of Senlac Hill in a dense formation, shoulder to shoulder behind a shield wall. William set up his forces just below and prepared for an assault. . The battle started at about 9 a.m. and would last all day. If William was going to win, he would need to find a way to break through the shield wall and create openings within the English formation that he could exploit. All Godwinson had to do was hold the line. It began when William ordered his archers to get into range of the English line and begin pelting them with arrows. However, due to the fact that they were firing at such a steep angle upwards, the arrows weren't able to strike the shields at the correct angle to penetrate them and instead just bounced off. William's opening move was ineffective. The next was to send in his infantry, who were better equipped and better trained than the English fyrd. If they could punch a hole through the wall or disrupt their formation, the day would be William's. But again, the terrain made an effective assault difficult, and Godwinson's forces were fiercely determined to stand fast and hold the line. Growing impatient, William tried a third time by leading a cavalry charge against the English shield wall, hoping to create an opening that his infantry could exploit. This, like his previous efforts, failed to yield any results, as the English huscarls, with their great axes, were able to hook riders off their horses or plunge the axes directly into the animals, throwing the rider to the ground. The French army began to fret that they wouldn't be able to get through the shield wall and would instead spend all day being pressed into the meat grinder on Senlac Hill. A rumour then began to spread among the panicked soldiers that William had been killed, which eventually caused a disorganised retreat as the French soldiers on the left abandoned their post and began running from the hill. Sensing a rout, the English soldiers bounded after them, hacking down anyone too slow to escape and attempting to push the fleeing soldiers from the battle. Thinking quickly, William, who was in fact not dead, removed his helmet in order to show his face and galloped up and down his line, screaming that he was still alive. This was just enough to rally his remaining cavalry, who then intercepted the English soldiers who broke in formation to chase the retreating French infantry. The pursuing English formed a quick improvised defence, but were vulnerable and out of position. They were quickly cut down. By this stage in the battle, it was early afternoon, and both sides regrouped to eat, recover, and prepare for the next fight. William had been unable to break the English line, and Godwinson, for as long as he remained on Senlac Hill, would be victorious. But the whole ordeal of the retreat and the subsequent slaughter of the pursuing English gave William an idea on how he could wrap up this fight. However, the second half of the battle started much like the first. Initially, the archers would fire an ineffective volley, then the infantry would advance and engage the shield wall before the cavalry came up to try and make gaps and exploit opportunities. This time, however, William gave orders to his cavalry to pretend to retreat on a given signal, and then, once the English abandoned the safety of the shield wall to pursue them, they would turn about and cut them down. According to the historical sources, this happened at least 2 or 3 times throughout the fight. It wasn't enough to get the shield wall to collapse completely, but it did thin the numbers of English soldiers on the field, and eventually there were gaps in the line. William ordered one last barrage of arrows, some of which slipped through the cracks in the wall, and one of which supposedly struck Harold Godwinson directly in the eye, killing him instantly. At the news that their king was dead, the English fyrd abandoned the fight and ran from the battlefield. The remaining huscarls, the king's professional guard, formed a defensive ring around Godwinson's body and fought tooth and nail for hours before eventually becoming overwhelmed. The day belonged to William of Normandy, who from that day onwards became known as William the Conqueror. Anglo-Saxon rule in England was snuffed out and a new Norman dynasty had begun. William marched to London shortly after, and on Christmas Day 1066 was crowned King of England, almost a year exactly since Edward the Confessor had died. The ceremony was performed in Westminster Abbey, the same one that Edward had completed during his lifetime, something he probably didn't see coming when he built it. William's triumph had serious consequences for the future of Britain. The English language began to change as the Saxon and Viking peasant population found themselves ruled by a French-speaking ruling class. Eventually, the two languages blended together, giving us the roots of modern English. This, by the way, is why we have two sets of words for so many different things. The common English word and the posh French word. Pig or pork, cow or beef, buy or purchase, hate or malice, drink or beverage, and so on. Not only did the English language change, but our politics did too. England became closer tied with continental Europe, and within 2 decades of his rule, he developed the feudal system within England, which would be the prevailing political system for the next 500 years. William also ordered the first ever census of England to try and figure out exactly who lived where and had what. It was called the Domesday Book and was essentially just a tool to measure the wealth of the nation and how much tax he could collect. But it created the germ of what would later be the mass bureaucratic culture that infuriates so many of us today. He also strongly, and I mean strongly, punished any rebels, including some northerners who refused to accept him as king and tried to shake the dust off of Edgar the Atheling to fight for him to be next. Edgar didn't participate, but the revolt was very real, and William responded with something called the Harrying of the North, where much farmland was destroyed, towns were looted, people were killed, and the land was left desolate and almost completely depopulated. William also began the construction of the White Tower, which now sits in the centre of the Tower of London, as well as around 100 other castles across the UK, including this one, which sits in the centre of my hometown, Colchester, and where, during my teaching days, we would take students on field trips to learn more about their local history. Interesting tidbit, this castle was actually built on the ruins of an old Roman temple which was burned down during Boudicca's revolt in 60 AD. You can still see Roman oyster shells in the cement of the foundations. Thinking about it another way, if you'd been alive during the completion of the castle in 1076, then Boudicca's revolt would have been just as far away in time as our modern era today. The more you know. Anyway, Hardrada died at Stamford Bridge, Godwinson died at Hastings, and William of Normandy emerged the victor. To celebrate his achievement and leave propaganda to prosperity, he commissioned this, the Bayeux Tapestry, which you should already recognise since I've been using images of it throughout this entire video. It's an enormous embroidered cloth, around 70 metres long from end to end, which tells us the entire story, at least through William's eyes, beginning with Godwinson's oath to support William and culminating with his victory at the Battle of Hastings. It has survived in almost perfect condition for nearly 1,000 years now. Its only real threat came during World War II, when Heinrich Himmler, commander of the SS, tried to gain personal control of the artifact, calling it, quote, important for our glamorous and cultured Germanic history. He was planning to hang it up in his castle. Luckily, he didn't get his way, and the tapestry was hidden underground for much of World War II. You can still see the Bayeux Tapestry today, by the way, in the Bayeux Museum, and you guessed it, Bayeux. William did not last as long as his famous tapestry, however, and, after becoming obscenely fat and intemperate during his final years, died, either from illness or infection, in 1087. During his funeral, his body was ceremonially lowered into a pre-built tomb before burial. Unfortunately, he'd grown too fat for his own tomb, and the monks present were obliged to try and physically stuff his rolls into the rather cramped box. William, always stubborn even in death, did not go willingly into his tomb, and when pressure was applied to try and squeeze him in, he burst, leaving a disgusting odour throughout the church. That's the comforting thing about history. You can try all you like to be the strongest man there ever was and commission great propaganda efforts to solidify your reputation, but in the end, prosperity catches up. The cult of personality withers away, the sins come to light, the myths are busted. Edward the Confessor became Eddie the Incompetent. Howard Hardrada turned out to be not that hard. and William of Normandy, the Conqueror, became a very messy box of farts. Anyway, I've been Jake. See ya. Subscribe if you like. It really helps. Cheers.